Okay, last part of fundamentally autosegmental characteristics in African tonal languages, specificational mismatch. And this one is kind of the most subtle because it's about underlying representations. And as you probably remember from 411, inferring things about URs is hard. It's just very abstract. It requires some kind of leaps in logic to get there. And so these are going to be a little bit more subtle than the other examples we've looked at so far. And we're going to start with another example from Larry Hyman again. This is from Arem. And what you can see here is two nouns, rat and hand, in two different constructions. So in the construction on the left, there's two words. For instance, for rat, it's kifu, kima. And that the first part here is the stem for rat, that's fu. And it has a prefix here, which is probably a classifier, if I had to guess. And then the second word in this construction is the numeral 1, which is ma, and it also has to agree with that classifier morpheme, although this is a different classifier than the one in the noun. What Larry Hyman is giving you here is the H's and L's. Those are the underlying representations that you can recover for these different morphemes by looking in different locations. And then he also gives you the diacritics on the vowels in the IPA, and those are the surface forms here. Below that, you have the exact same construction, but with hand. So one hand, kiwo, kima. And then on the right, you have a different construction for both these nouns, where the morpheme for hand here is wo. So you have this rat and this hand. These are a little bit different. They don't take classifiers. Instead, it just goes noun demonstrative. So rat this, fu kin, and hand this, wo kin. First thing to notice here, what are the tonal realizations of rat and hand, of fu and wo? Well, they're both high in both constructions, both high-toned. Right? So these are realized phonetically exactly the same in all these contexts. And so what you'd want to say at a first pass here is that they must have underlyingly high tones associated with their vowels. This is rat and hand. Right? What is the interesting part here is what's going on after these two nouns. So what happens on the noun stays the same. They look like they should be represented identically because they pattern the same in the output, except they affect different items to following them in different ways. So in the first case here, the claim is that this numeral classifier, the second key in these constructions, is underlyingly low-toned. In the case of rat, it looks like you must get delinking of this low tone and rightward spreading of the high tone. So this comes out in the surface form as a high tone. But in wo, this doesn't happen. This stays low-toned, and in the output, it's a low-toned output. Right? So these two nouns are realized the same way, right? But the morpheme that comes after them is realized differently depending on which noun preceded it. There's another example with the second construction on the right here, this rat and this hand. You can see something similar going on here. And this is when the two roots are followed by, instead, a high-toned thing after them. In the case of rat, that high-toned thing is just realized as high-toned. But in the case of hand, that following thing is realized as a downstepped high tone. That's what that little arrow means. And downstepped high tones are a little bit complicated. We're not going to spend too much time on them in this section. But basically, in lots of languages, what you get when you have a phonological sequence of a high, then a low, then another high, instead of really getting a low tone in between the two highs, you just end up with a second high tone that's a little bit lower than the first one. It's referred to as a downstepped high tone, and it usually comes from a high-low-high sequence. And that seems to be what's happening in Arem here. So what's the analysis? How can we get this to work? That this high tone noun allows spreading, while this one doesn't. And when there's a high tone following, you get downstepping of that following high tone following this root, but not following this one. How could that work? The claim is that wo, in its underlying representation here, has this high tone that's linked to its vowel, and it has a second tone that's floating, that is not linked to anything. So this is a floating tone. It's a kind of abstract analysis, although it's necessary to deal with a range of phenomena in tone languages. It's very hard to analyze a tone language without having to posit at least some morphemes that have tones in them which are not associated with any segmental material. And that's the case for the contrast here between fu and wo. The claim is that wo is going to have the same tone as fu on the surface, but it also has this second floating tone, which can do stuff over here. Or in this case, maybe it just spreads, or maybe it blocks spreading of the high. Either way, there's no way to tell the difference, but something about this being here keeps the high tone from spreading the way it does up here, where there's no floating tone. Now, if this low were to associate with this following syllable that already has a low tone, phonetically we would predict absolutely no difference from this low tone in isolation. They should sound exactly the same. And so generally, and this includes in your homework assignment, we use what's called a convention to just, if you end up with two adjacent identical tones on the same syllable, you just erase one of them because we don't think there's any sound difference between the two realizations. This is not necessary. It's not super important for the theory. That's why they call it a convention. It's referred to as the twin sister convention in the homework. And so if you want to, if you end up with a low on the same vowel, you can feel free to just erase one of them. It doesn't really matter either way. Okay, so that would help explain why even though these two nouns are realized the same way on the surface, they have a different effect on material to their right. What about the second example here, where it's high-toned material on the right? Well, again, we're going to posit this abstract difference in phonological underlying representations. Floating tone for this guy, no floating tone for this guy. You put something high-toned over here. In this case, it's going to be king. Which is underlyingly high-toned. Right. And here, absolutely nothing happens. You have high tone, and that's what you get in the output. But here, this floating low tone needs to go somewhere or delete. In this particular language, the claim is that when you have a sequence of H, L, and H, it basically incorporates into this following syllable, but the phonetic realization here, rather than being a rise, is a downstepped high tone. Now, the process by which we get from low-high to downstepped high only in the presence of a preceding high is complicated, and we don't need to worry about it. The main point here is just that there has to be something different between these two nouns, and the claim is that this difference, as well as the preceding one that we just looked at, can be handled only if you assume that there is a floating tone at the right edge of this morpheme that's not associated with any segmental material. So specificational mismatch, lexical representations specify a tone, but don't specify any segmental features that it's associated with. Right? Other direction would be lexical representations specify some segmental features, but don't specify any tone related with it. And so in a sort of trivial sense, that would be true in any intonational language, right, including all the languages spoken in our classroom except for Mandarin, where, you know, at a first pass, every single morpheme in these languages has a bunch of segmental material specified with no tones. A little bit more interesting would be to show that in a language which does have lexical tones in general, there can be certain morphemes that are specified for segments but no tones. And so this is an example from Mende, and this is some of the early work by Bill Laban or William Laban that helped inspire the autosegmental framework in the first place. This is from Mende, and here's what we see here. We have a bunch of nouns in their isolation forms on the left. So there's a one-syllable high-tone noun, ko, two-syllable high-tone, bele, two-syllable low-tone, bele, and a high-low two-syllable word, ngila. So I'm guessing that Mende is not a Bantu language because every Bantu language has the morpheme mwa for dog. So Mende is from a different language family. Okay, so what do we find here? Well, we're looking at two postpositions, which again, postpositions are just like prepositions except they come after the noun. And we have two of them here, an in postposition, which looks like it's hu, and an on postposition that looks like it's ma. And both of them are going to pattern the same in the phonology. The question is, are these high-toned or low-toned morphemes? And the answer is, it depends entirely on the noun that comes before them. So if you... so if you pronounce these nouns in isolation, you'll find that this one is high-toned. And again, for right now, we can either have a single high tone linked to two vowels or two separate high tones. Doesn't really matter. That will matter later, in a few weeks, but not for right now. And so here's a way of representing the contrast between the tones in house and the tones in dog. And the question is, well, what's the underlying representation of this postposition? And the answer is, it doesn't matter. There's no reason to posit any tones in the underlying representation for the postposition because it just takes on the tone of whatever syllable precedes it. So here, where there's a high tone to its left, it surfaces as high-toned. Right? You can see this in the middle column here. Belehu, so in the house or in-house. And if it's a low tone over on this left syllable, that spreads, and you get output low tone. Gilahu, or gilahu. Right? So again, there's absolutely no reason to posit any underlying tones in these postpositions. Hu and ma works exactly the same way. So this is the opposite kind of specificational mismatch. Even in a language with lexical contrastive tones, there can be segmental material that just isn't specified with any tonal material whatsoever. So again, specificational mismatch. In the lexicon, you can have tones with no segments. We refer to those as floating tones. Or you can have segments with no tones. And these would be referred to as toneless affixes. So those are the three kinds of fundamentally autosegmental mismatch. And this autosegmental theory that includes delinking and spreading and association lines helps us deal with these fundamentally autosegmental behaviors, as well as the general mobility of tone. It just sort of moves all over the place with reference to segmental material, right? And so that's what autosegmental theory is for, and it does a wonderful job describing these processes. Each one of these would be virtually impossible to write as a rewrite rule over feature matrices. We saw that in class for the Shona example, but it should be clear, trying to describe things like this using, plus high becomes minus high following x, y, and z, it's going to be almost impossible to get these rules right using that kind of notation. They're fundamentally different than the other kinds of processes we've seen, and autosegmental representations are a way of complicating our theory of representations. This is certainly a more complicated theory of how phonological features work than this theory was. This is a much simpler theory. You have a bunch of features, each one of them is specified, and they live together in a list that's followed by the next list, right? Simple theory, complicated theory, association lines, spreading, delinking, different tiers for different kinds of phonological features. So we're getting a much more complicated theory of representations here. But the hope is that this is going to allow us to keep a simpler theory of rules. All of these things that we've just seen with tones sort of all almost follow from these representations because there's simple rules like spreading and delinking and so on and so forth that we can use to get the processes that we've been trying to model here, which would be extremely difficult with a simpler theory of representations. If we kept this simpler theory of representations, we saw this briefly for Shona, it's not that it would necessarily be impossible to rewrite the rules. It's just that they'd be super, super complicated and difficult to write in this kind of a notation with the rewrite rule formalism. Much, much harder to do. So for this kind of domain, we think it's a good trade-off to have more complicated representations in order to get simple rules that will describe tonal processes beautifully. The last part of this section, though, asks, or do they? And we'll see next class that once we move on to other tone languages, in particular East Asian and Southeast Asian tone languages, it's much less clear that these representations are really winning us the same prizes that they do with African tone languages. So that's what we'll talk about next time.